On November 9th, 1997, one of the most controversial events in wrestling history occurred in Montreal during the World Wrestling Federation's annual Survivor Series pay-per-view. That night's main event featured Shawn Michaels challenging Bret Hart for the World Heavyweight Championship. After nearly 20 minutes, Michaels locked Hart into a sharpshooter, Hart's signature finishing move. At that moment, a referee suddenly called for the bell and announced that Michaels was the winner, despite Hart never having actually tapped out. This was not the outcome Bret Hart had been promised. He was not merely angry for being deceived, but furious at losing the title in Canada, where the Hart family were looked at as local heroes. The events of that night would forever be known as the Montreal Screwjob, a moment that has sparked intense debate for decades. Many wrestlers and fans at the time argued that Bret had been treated unjustly, but over the years, some have changed their opinion and come to believe that Hart perhaps deserved the betrayal. Some people, such as former Intercontinental Champion Scott Hall, have even suggested that the entire incident was staged and that Hart was in on it all along.
Bret was a mark about it. Bret's really selfish about doing business. It's all about him. He doesn't care about anybody else.
The other thing is,
in an industry where the line between reality and fiction is intentionally blurred, how does one begin to unravel the truth of such an event? Virtually every wrestler and official who was involved in the WWF at the time has offered their own version of the story. Documentaries have been made and countless interviews have been given. I have sifted through hours of footage and dozens of articles in an attempt to piece together a definitive account of what transpired, not only that night, but in the days, weeks, and months leading up to it. This is the history of the night that shined the light on the fragile balance between the scripted world of wrestling and the raw human emotion that fueled it. This is the story of the Montreal Screwjob, the most controversial night in wrestling history. In the 1980s, Hulk Hogan was the WWF's undisputed star, but by the early 90s, his popularity began to weaken. Vince McMahon, the mastermind behind the WWF, needed to find a new face for his promotion. He initially thought he had found Hogan's successor in the Ultimate Warrior, who pinned Hogan at WrestleMania 6. However, despite being extremely popular with the fans, Warrior would prove to be unreliable, and this would lead to frequent title changes in the years that followed. During this transitional period, Bret Hart had evolved from a primarily tag team wrestler into a highly skilled singles competitor. In 1991, Hart defeated Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig for the Intercontinental Championship at SummerSlam, and later that year he won the King of the Ring tournament. Bret's father, Stu Hart, ran Stampede Wrestling in Calgary, and Bret, having been raised in the business, quickly emerged as one of the WWF's most reliable and talented stars. Even though he held the Intercontinental Championship and not the more prestigious World title, Bret headlined SummerSlam 1992, where he faced his brother-in-law, Davey Boy Smith, also known as the British Bulldog. The match would be held at Wembley Stadium in London. Despite losing the title to the Bulldog, fans and critics alike hailed it as one of the greatest matches in wrestling history, with Pro Wrestling Illustrated naming it Match of the Year. WWE.com would later declare it the greatest match in SummerSlam history. Bret knew that his time to challenge for the World Heavyweight Championship would come soon, and that moment arrived on October 12, 1992, when he faced wrestling legend Ric Flair in Saskatchewan, Canada. Flair had been a multi-time champion in WCW before coming to the WWF, where he won the heavyweight championship in the 1992 Royal Rumble, only to lose it to Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8 before reclaiming it a few months later. Ironically, one of Bret Hart's first defenses as champion would be against Shawn Michaels at the 1992 Survivor Series. Michaels, like Bret, had started his career as a tag team specialist, initially as part of the Rockers with Marty Jannetty. On October 30th, 1990, the Rockers defeated Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart for the tag team championships at a Saturday night's main event taping, but Vince later changed his mind and gave the belts back to Bret and Neidhart. Even though the match was taped and the titles were won in front of a live audience, the match never aired, and WWE doesn't even acknowledge that the Rockers were ever champions. It is as if the match was erased from the record books. The reason why Vince changed his mind about giving the Rockers the belts was due to Jim Neidhart. Vince believed that Neidhart wasn't going to re-sign with the WWF, so he took the belts off the Hart Foundation just in case. Only after Neidhart re-signed did Vince order the Rockers to give the belts back. After branching out as a singles competitor, Michaels followed in Bret's footsteps by winning the Intercontinental Championship. He actually won the belt the first time from Davey Boy Smith shortly after the Bulldog had defeated Bret for it. Bret would go on to hold the WWF Heavyweight Championship until WrestleMania 9, where he lost the title to Yokozuna, who was subsequently defeated in a shocking 22-second match by a returning Hulk Hogan. It is widely believed that Hogan was awarded the title due to an upcoming tour of Europe. Vince McMahon, the WWF's owner, felt Hogan's name recognition overseas would help boost tickets in foreign markets. However, instead of dropping the belt to Bret after the European tour was over, Hogan dropped it back to Yokozuna. In his autobiography, Hitman: My Real Life in the Cartoon World of Wrestling, Bret claims that Hogan didn't want to lose to him. Hogan, however, disputed this claim, asserting that the plan had always been for him to lose to Yokozuna, who was the top heel in the organization. This makes sense because Hart was a babyface, and it would have been strange to have Hogan start a feud with him. Despite this, Bret regained the title at WrestleMania 10 by defeating Yokozuna. He would go on to hold the championship for most of 1994 until losing it to Bob Backlund at Survivor Series, only to win it back a third time at the 1995 Survivor Series. By 1996, no other wrestler in the WWF stood at Bret's level except for Shawn Michaels, who won that year's Royal Rumble, earning the right to challenge Bret at WrestleMania 12. Their Iron Man match at WrestleMania 12 is widely regarded as one of the greatest matches in history. With less than a minute remaining, neither competitor had scored a pinfall or submission, but Bret placed Michaels into a sharpshooter. Michaels refused to tap out, and after the clock hit 0, officials decided that instead of declaring the match a draw, it should continue into sudden death overtime, where Michaels, after wrestling for over an hour, emerged victorious. Meanwhile, as Hart and Michaels were feuding for the WWF Championship, WCW began aggressively challenging Vince McMahon's promotion. The company launched Nitro, a Monday Night Wrestling program which directly competed with the WWF's flagship show Raw. WCW began luring talent away from the WWF, including big names like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman, formerly known as the 1-2-3 Kid. For years, Vince never considered WCW to be a threat, and many WWF wrestlers watched WCW just to make fun of it. After his loss at WrestleMania, Bret was approached by Eric Bischoff, the head of WCW, with a lucrative 3-year deal at almost $3 million a year. Fearing that Bret might sign with WCW, Vince McMahon countered with one of the most substantial contracts in WWF history, a 20-year deal. Bret would earn $1.5 million over the next 3 years, $500,000 for the following 7 years, and $250,000 for the final decade, which was expected to see him transition into a managerial or non-wrestling role. McMahon was nervous about offering such a large contract, but Carl DeMarco, who was head of WWF's Canadian operations, insisted. DeMarco claimed that many fans showed up to wrestling shows in Canada just to see Bret. While the WCW deal would have been more financially lucrative, Bret ultimately decided to stay with the WWF, driven by loyalty to Vince, who had made him a star. It's intriguing to consider what might have happened if Bret had left WCW in '96. At the time, most WWF stars were being absorbed into NWO, a faction led by Hulk Hogan. Had Bret joined WCW, he might have been placed in the NWO, which would have meant he would be playing second fiddle to Hogan. Vince even told Bret that if he went to WCW, Bischoff would have no idea how to properly use him. After re-signing with the WWF, Bret would win his 4th world title in a 4-way elimination match against Stone Cold Steve Austin, Vader, and The Undertaker. He would hold the title for less than a week and then began feuding with Stone Cold, who was being built up as the next big star of the company. The two would have an unforgettable submission match at WrestleMania 13, widely regarded as one of the finest bouts of their careers. During the match, Bret put a bloody Austin in the sharpshooter, but Austin refused to give up, eventually passing out from the pain. Bret would go on later that year to defeat The Undertaker at SummerSlam, claiming the World Championship for a 5th time, during which he began to embrace a new persona, carrying the Canadian flag to the ring with him and proudly proclaiming the superiority of Canada over the United States. With this new gimmick, Hart basically made himself a heel in the US, but a babyface in Canada. Despite the memorable matches and captivating storylines, by late 1997, the WWF was facing severe financial difficulties. Vince McMahon had to take out loans just to keep the company afloat, and several executives had to take pay cuts. Meanwhile, WCW's NWO angle was dominating, and Nitro had begun to defeat Raw in the ratings. If McMahon couldn't turn things around, the future of the WWF was in jeopardy. As a result of this, McMahon could no longer afford to honor Bret's contract. When he informed Bret, McMahon encouraged him to reach out to Bischoff and see if WCW was still interested. He also mentioned rumors of Hogan possibly leaving WCW after his match with Sting at Starrcade. It would turn out that these rumors were started by Hogan himself. The Hulkster wanted WCW to think he was leaving so that they would offer him more money. Hogan had no real intention on going back to the WWF. Bret was able to negotiate a new contract with WCW for 3 years at $2.5 million. A smaller sum than he had been offered the year before, but still a significant amount. Bischoff also told Bret that he would only have to work 125 days. By comparison, Bret was working over twice as many dates in the WWF. Bischoff even sweetened the deal by telling Bret he didn't even have to show up to events until the shows were just about to start. So in WCW, Bret would be making more money, working less, and had permission to show up late every day. However, a major issue soon arose. Bret was still the champion, so he had to lose the belt before leaving. And when Bret was informed that he would be losing the championship to Shawn Michaels at the upcoming Survivor Series, he was not having it. Not only was Bret being asked to drop the belt to Michaels, but the event would take place in his home country in Canada. It was no secret that Michaels and Bret despised each other. Shawn had previously been the highest paid wrestler in the WWF and viewed himself as the hardest worker in the business. When Bret signed that original 20-year contract, he began earning almost twice as much as Michaels. On a May 12th episode of Raw, Michaels and Bret closed the show. Right before the episode went off the air, Michaels was supposed to kick Bret. However, Bret forgot his lines, and by the time Michaels kicked Bret, Raw had already gone off the air, so the fans at home never saw it. Michaels claimed that Hart forgot the lines on purpose just to make him look bad. A week later, Michaels cut a promo about Bret, referring to him as having sunny days, a reference to Tammy Sytch, a manager who was close to Bret. Sytch, known by her ring name Sunny, had been a manager and major star in the mid-90s, at one point becoming the most downloaded woman on the internet. Sunny was also known to be very promiscuous. The comment was unscripted, and it seemed as though Michaels was insinuating that the married Bret Hart was having an affair with Sunny. In truth, however, it was Michaels who had been in the relationship with Sunny. Allegedly, Bret's father reached out to him asking if there was any truth to the rumors about the affair. Apparently, the rumor had caused quite a bit of friction within the Hart family. Bret later confronted Michaels in the locker room, and the two became involved in a physical altercation, which was eventually broken up by Pat Patterson and Jerry the King Lawler.
I've come out of one of the offices, I've been making some notes or whatever, and here comes Steve Lombardi, Brooklyn Brawler. Holy Shawn and Bret just got in a fight. I mean, what the...
During the altercation, Bret ripped a large chunk of Shawn's hair from his head. Michaels, claiming that the WWF was an unsafe work environment, took the hair to Vince's office. Jim Cornette, manager and former owner of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, was in the office with Vince at the time, and after seeing the hair, he took it as a souvenir.
Vince gets up and follows him. And I've never told this story publicly, but it still tickles me to this day. I looked at that f***ing hunk of hair. I said, this is f***ing great. When I go home to who's now my ex-wife, but I said, I gotta have a visual aid, and I picked that up and stuck it in a paper bag and took the hair home. I said, look at this. When I got home, I said, they went down, they had the f***ing scuffle, blah, 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 and look at this f***ing hunk of hair, and she put it in a plastic bag and kept it. It was like the ultimate wrestling souvenir, and then, of course...
Both Bret and Sitch continue to deny that an affair ever happened. But Tammy, in her autobiography Star Shattered, said that Bret and her did share a kiss once, and that one of the major reasons why Michaels hated Bret was because he legitimately thought that Sonny was in a relationship with Bret. Following the confrontation, Michaels stormed out of the arena, refusing to return to work. He wanted to be released from his contract so that he could join his friends Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in WCW. Vince McMahon had to personally fly to Michaels' home in Texas to convince him to come back. Throughout the 1990s, Michaels proved to be a difficult personality to manage. His arrogance, constant disputes over matches, and struggles with drug and alcohol abuse made him difficult to work with. His close friend, fellow wrestler Triple H, famously recounted how Michaels would often pass out after shows, and Triple H would have to carry him on a luggage cart to their hotel rooms. On top of his substance abuse, Michaels was also known to refuse to work with certain wrestlers. For instance, in 1996, a title match against Vader was nearly scrapped because Michaels objected to working with Vader because he claimed the man smelled bad. Michaels had even gotten into an actual bar fight back in 1995 and was beaten up so bad that he had to give up the Intercontinental Championship to take time off to recover. Michaels also participated in an event that would become known as the Curtain Call. After an untelevised cage match between himself and Diesel, later known as Kevin Nash, Michaels and Nash would embrace each other, which made no sense to the audience because they were supposed to be enemies. The two were also joined by Triple H and Scott Hall. This would be Hall and Nash's last night in the WWF, so the four of them, who were good friends, wanted to celebrate. A fan snuck a video camera into Madison Square Garden and recorded the incident. McMahon was furious because the four of them broke character, or kayfabe, as it's called in the wrestling business. But because Michaels was the face of the promotion at the time, McMahon wasn't able to punish him as much as he probably would have liked. Despite his off-camera difficulties, Michaels was undeniably talented, with in-ring abilities that few could rival. Perhaps only Bret Hart himself could match Michaels. It was precisely for this reason that Vince McMahon tolerated Michaels' behavior. Shawn and Vince shared a close bond. Michaels has said that he looked up to Vince as a father figure. Initially, McMahon agreed with Bret's stance and assured him that he wouldn't have to lose the title to Shawn. A plan was devised for a disqualification finish. At some point, the referee would get knocked out, and Michaels would place Bret in the sharpshooter. Bret, in turn, would reverse the hold, causing Michaels to tap out as the referee was unconscious. As Bret attempted to revive the referee, Michaels would recover and would use his finisher, the Sweet Chin Music, and go for a pin. A second referee would then enter to make the count, but Bret's allies, Owen Hart, Jim Neidhart, and Davey Boy Smith, would interfere, preventing Michaels from securing the win. Triple H and Chyna would then show up, and ultimately the chaos outside the ring would result in a disqualification, and Bret would relinquish the title the following night on Raw. That was the original plan. It's what Bret and almost everyone else thought was going to happen. However, just days before the Survivor Series pay-per-view, McMahon began to reconsider. News of Bret's impending move to WCW had leaked, and the hardcore fan base knew of it. Vince feared that Eric Bischoff might publicly announce Bret's departure during Monday's WCW Nitro, which aired an hour earlier than Raw. Or worse, what if Bret himself showed up on Nitro? This fear was not without precedent. In 1991, when Ric Flair briefly joined the WWF, he brought the WCW World Heavyweight Championship belt with him. Flair had paid a $25,000 deposit for the belt that was never returned to him after he quit, so Flair kept the belt, at least temporarily. What if Bret did something similar? When WCW launched Nitro in late 1995, they'd already demonstrated their willingness to fight dirty by having Medusa, the WWF Women's Champion, show up on Nitro with the belt and throw it into a trash can. Vince feared that Bischoff, who had earned the nickname ATM Eric, might make an offer to Bret, possibly even bribing him to show up on Nitro with the WWF title. In retrospect, many have criticized Vince for waiting until Survivor Series to strip Bret of the title.
Why didn't you think to take the fucking belt off of him before you freed him up to negotiate with fucking Bischoff to get the $1 million?
Vince had known for months that Bret was likely to leave, but wrestling storylines are often planned well in advance. That year, WWE had been carefully building towards a clash between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Michaels at WrestleMania, while the Michaels vs. Hart feud had begun at SummerSlam. At that event, Michaels had served as special guest referee for a title match between Bret and The Undertaker. During the match, Bret attempted to use a chair on The Undertaker, but was thwarted by Michaels, leading to an accidental chair shot on The Undertaker. This moment resulted in Bret winning the championship and further escalating the conflict between himself and Michaels. Shawn had also defeated The Undertaker a month earlier in the first ever Hell in a Cell match, which made him the #1 contender, so he was guaranteed a title shot. Though Bret's contract with WCW wouldn't officially take effect until December 5th, Vince could have theoretically had Bret lose the belt on Raw the next day. However, title changes were almost exclusively reserved for pay-per-view events at the time. The only exception prior to this was a 1997 Raw episode where Bret had lost the title to Sid Vicious after interference from Stone Cold Steve Austin. This incident had been part of a build-up to their match at WrestleMania 13. The original plan had been for Bret and Michaels to face off again at WrestleMania 13, but Michaels suffered an injury which forced a change of plans. Bret has suggested that Michaels exaggerated the severity of his injury and willingly gave up the championship just to avoid having to lose to Bret at WrestleMania. Several other wrestlers, including The Undertaker, have agreed with this. Hart supports this theory by claiming that he and Michaels once had a conversation in the locker room a few weeks before their match at Survivor Series. Hart assured Michaels that if Vince ever asked him to put Michaels over, he wouldn't hesitate to do so. Michaels allegedly responded by saying he would never do the same for Bret, a conversation that was witnessed by several other wrestlers. It should also be noted that Bret allegedly had a reasonable creative control clause in his contract, which allowed him to have a say in how his character was portrayed during the final 30 days of his contract.
For the purpose of going forward, we should define a term right now because it's going to come up. What is reasonable creative control, and what is unreasonable creative control?
Well, I'll get on my soapbox now. I believe a creative control clause in any contract is complete bullshit.
Is it said anywhere that if I don't feel your proposition is reasonable, I have the final say?
No.
Right.
So what's reasonable?
Oh.
While the exact parameters of this clause remain debated, it was meant to protect wrestlers from being placed in unflattering storylines as they neared the end of their runs. There is speculation that this clause might have granted Bret the right to decide how he would drop the title, but it is unclear just how much power Bret truly held. While creative control clauses were common in the WCW, where Hulk Hogan famously had a clause that gave him significant influence over his storylines, in the WWF, Vince had always made all the decisions, and it seems extremely unlikely that Vince would ever agree to a contract that would allow another wrestler to refuse to drop the belt. But then again, Vince had been desperate to keep Bret under contract. At some point, it was suggested that Bret see if he could renegotiate his contract with WCW so that he could drop the belt at the December pay-per-view instead, but Michaels was against that. The true origins of the idea to screw Bret out of the title remain murky. Pat Patterson, the match agent, was responsible for many of the match's planned spots, including Michaels' use of the sharpshooter. However, it is unclear whether Patterson was aware of the full extent of the plan. From the research I've conducted, it seems unlikely that Patterson was complicit in the scheme. Both Vince Russo and Jim Cornette, two of the company's writers, have claimed responsibility for suggesting the idea to Vince. Russo was head writer for a while and is credited with helping modernize the WWF by pushing edgier, more backstage-focused storylines, while Cornette, a former promoter with a deep love of traditional wrestling, advocated for a more straightforward approach to storytelling. Despite their differences, both Russo and Cornette agreed that Bret had to lose the title.
So now Vince comes back to the table, and Vince's fear was Bret was going to show up on Nitro with the WWE title.
Right.
That was his fear. That's why he had to get the belt off of Bret. Because remember, Medusa had done that.
Yep.
History was not going to repeat itself. So, bro, we're at Vince's house, and we're going way into the night now. Out of mere frustration, I say, Vince, it, bro. Have Shawn put Bret in the sharpshooter and have the referee call for the belt. Bro, out of pure frustration.
Cornette, in particular, once proposed that Bret drop the belt to Ken Shamrock instead of Michaels, arguing that Shamrock, a legitimate fighter, could put Bret into a real submission hold and force him to tap out. This would make the match look legitimate and make Bret's loss appear more credible. In the world of professional wrestling, when a wrestler is nearing the end of their run with a company, it has long been tradition for them to put over a new talent, to lose in a way that elevates the next star. This tradition has remained intact over the years. When Kurt Angle retired in 2019, his final match was a loss to Baron Corbin. And when Ric Flair left for WCW in 1993, he lost to Mr. Perfect in a loser leaves town match. This practice of double-crossing wrestlers was also not new. In 1985, when women's champion Wendy Richter had fallen out with McMahon over pay disputes, McMahon decided that she could no longer be trusted. Rather than ask her to drop the belt, McMahon orchestrated a scheme in which Richter was screwed out of her title during a match against a masked wrestler known as the Spider Lady, who was later revealed to be the legendary Fabulous Moolah. During the match, Moolah ignored the plans and immediately pinned Richter. The referee was in on the plan and made a fast 3 count and awarded Moolah the belt, even though it appeared that Richter had kicked out. The challenge of executing a screwjob finish in wrestling is that it requires not only double-crossing the wrestler, but also maintaining the illusion that everything is real. The Survivor Series, like all wrestling events, was an orchestrated spectacle. But for the fans to fully immerse themselves in the experience, they needed to believe in the authenticity of what they were witnessing. It was essential for Bret to lose the title in such a way that the audience would believe it was part of the larger story, not an act of betrayal behind the scenes. Before the match, both Vader and the British Bulldog warned Bret Hart that he might be screwed out of the title. Neither Vader nor the Bulldog knew for certain that anything was officially planned, but given their extensive experience across various promotions, they had witnessed firsthand the underhanded tactics used to strip titles from wrestlers before. In fact, the Bulldog had just recently been betrayed by Vince. 2 months prior, at the one-night-only pay-per-view in England, the Bulldog was the reigning European champion and was supposed to beat Michaels in the main event. Just hours before the show started, Vince went to Bulldog and told him that there had been a change in plans. Michaels was going to beat him for the championship. After the match was over, Davey Boy lost, and fans booed Michaels and threw garbage in the ring because they were so upset. Smith had even invited his sister, who was fighting cancer, to watch him and dedicated the match to her. It is also interesting to point out that even though he was world champion, Bret did not main event either the One Night Only or Bad Blood pay-per-views, and it was Michaels that won the final match at each event. Bret later confessed that the reason he didn't suspect anything was amiss was that the referee assigned to the match that night was Earl Hebner, a man Bret knew and trusted. During the plane ride to Montreal, Bret even paid for Hebner to sit in first class next to him, where the two spoke at length about the upcoming match. Bret claimed that Hebner reassured him that he would never betray him. In his biography Heartbreak and Triumph, Shawn Michaels states that Hebner was not informed of the plan until just 10 minutes before the match began, when Michaels pulled him aside. However, Hebner himself contends that it was not Michaels who briefed him, but rather another figure, one that I haven't mentioned yet, but who may very well be the only person besides Vince McMahon who knows the full truth of what transpired. That person is Gerald Briscoe. In an interview, Briscoe shared his side of the story. He explained that McMahon had a production meeting the day before Survivor Series, attended by producers and agents including Briscoe, Bruce Pritchard, and Kevin Dunn. The meeting lasted 3 hours and concluded with McMahon stating that the outcome of the final match was to be determined. He mentioned needing to discuss certain matters with Bret and Michaels before making a final decision. After the meeting, Vince asked Briscoe to remain for a few minutes. Once the others had left, Vince locked the doors and checked the nearby bathrooms to ensure that nobody else was present. He confided in Briscoe, explaining that he had a problem with Bret and needed to get the belt off of him. Briscoe suggested that Vince consult with Pat Patterson, but Vince refused, citing his concern that Patterson and Bret were too close, and that Patterson might reveal the plan. Vince's primary worry was that Bret, once he realized he had been deceived, might retaliate violently against Michaels. While Michaels was an adept performer, he lacked the wrestling pedigree of Bret, an accomplished amateur wrestler far stronger than Michaels. The two agreed that once the match ended, they would have to get Michaels away from the ring as quick as possible for his own safety. Vince then asked Briscoe to secretly meet with Shawn in his hotel room that night to go over the details of the plan and teach Shawn some wrestling holds to use in case Bret tried to engage in a real physical confrontation. Briscoe claims that it was he who suggested the match conclude with Michaels applying Bret's own sharpshooter, reasoning that a quick pinfall would be too risky as Bret would almost certainly kick out if he suspected anything. When Briscoe informed Hebner of the plan, Hebner initially resisted, feeling that betraying Bret in such a manner was morally wrong. However, Briscoe told Hebner that if he refused to cooperate, he would be fired and blacklisted from working anywhere else.
When Briscoe gave me the news, the number one man other than Vince McMahon, I told my brother, get my together. When Briscoe was talking to me, he laid it out, and I go, I don't know. I just don't know. Briscoe disarmed, Briscoe graphic. What do you mean you don't know? He's got $3 million contract down there. Is he going to give you any of it? What are you going to do? I go, I don't know, Jerry. Bless his heart. And I go.
Hebner was instructed that once the bell rang, he was to exit the ring immediately and leave the arena. Hebner's twin brother, who also worked for the WWF, was told to retrieve Earl's bags from the locker room and have the car ready. When the match concluded, it took Bret mere seconds to realize what had transpired. In an emotional outburst, he spat on Vince's face before jumping out of the ring and furiously tearing apart the camera and television equipment. As Michaels exited the ring, Briscoe is seen escorting him backstage and telling Michaels to hold the belt above his head. Briscoe later explained that he was concerned about a fan possibly throwing something at Michaels in retaliation because the crowd was very upset and confused. Despite Briscoe's advice, Michaels did not leave the arena immediately. Instead, he headed towards the locker room and was soon confronted by Bret. It's worth noting that Bret had been filming a documentary, Wrestling with Shadows, which followed him closely in the weeks leading up to the event. The film crew was present in the locker room during the aftermath. Wrestling with Shadows, directed by Paul Jay, had received unprecedented access to the WWF. McMahon agreed to allow the cameras backstage, but his only stipulation was that Jay refrain from filming The Undertaker out of character. When Bret confronted Michaels in the locker room, he asked Shawn if he was complicit in the scheme. Michaels faked ignorance. Several other wrestlers entered the locker room, including The Undertaker, who told everyone he was going to get Vince and make him explain himself.
That's fine. So I went back and was sitting in Vince's office watching the match, and then it all went down. All hell breaks loose, and I ended up working my way to Bret's locker room, and just like, I cannot believe that this happened. And finally, I left there, and I went to get Vince. So I was like, Vince has got to address this to Bret.
When Mick Foley, a close friend of Bret's brother Owen, was one of the wrestlers most upset by the incident. Foley threatened to go on strike, refusing to attend Raw the following night. He hoped that other wrestlers would join him, but ultimately Foley was the only major talent to miss the event.
And then my wife read my contract to me, and I realized I just breached it and legally couldn't work anywhere in the world for 5 years. So the next day I came back, hat in hand, and was welcomed back, no questions asked. But the Hart family, Lindsay, the Harts appreciated that, right?
Very much.
The one-day walkout was one day longer than most.
McMahon told everyone not to blame Michaels. He said that the entire thing was his idea and took full responsibility. McMahon claimed that he did what had to be done because he couldn't risk the possibility of Bret or WCW destroying the company. The following night on Raw, Vince recorded a controversial interview explaining his actions to the fans. This was one of the first instances in which McMahon broke kayfabe and openly acknowledged that wrestling matches were scripted. In the interview, he famously said that Bret had disrespected the business and made a selfish decision, and that it was ultimately Bret who screwed Bret. This moment marked the beginning of Vince McMahon's transformation into the on-screen villain, Mr. McMahon, a character who would soon engage in a feud with rising star Stone Cold Steve Austin, in what would become one of the biggest storylines in WWE history and help push the WWE to unprecedented heights, and ultimately run the WCW out of business. Because of this, some fans have speculated that the entire Montreal Screwjob may have been a work, but evidence to support this theory is lacking. Scott Hall claims that Bret and McMahon both planned everything, because after the match was over, Bret could be seen writing the letters WCW in the air with his finger. Hall said that the camera should have cut away, but it didn't, so McMahon and the crew must have known that Bret was going to do it. The problem with Hall's theory is that the footage of Bret drawing WCW in the air didn't actually appear on TV that night. The pay-per-view ended after Michaels left the ring. That footage of Bret having a meltdown was aired later as part of recaps and documentaries of the event. Vince had long warned Bret that if he went to WCW, the company wouldn't know what to do with him, a sentiment that ultimately proved true. Bret's time in WCW, though high profile, was underwhelming, and most fans consider his run to be lackluster. Bret made his first appearance on WCW Nitro on December 15th, playing a prominent role in the build-up to the company's Starrcade pay-per-view. However, because of a 60-day non-compete clause, Bret was unable to wrestle at Starrcade, and instead served as special guest referee in a match between WCW President Eric Bischoff and Larry Zbyszko. The match was heavily hyped as Bischoff had implied that Bret would be joining the New World Order, but Bret ended up declaring Zbyszko the winner after catching Bischoff cheating and subsequently applied the sharpshooter on Bischoff. At Starrcade, Bret would also play a role in the main event, which saw Hulk Hogan face Sting in one of the most anticipated matches in wrestling history. The match ended with Sting being pinned by Hogan, only for Bret to claim that the referee had made a fast count and insisted on restarting the match. But the problem was, the referee hadn't actually made a fast count at all. Although Bret would go on to win the United States Championship in 1998, and briefly hold the World Championship twice, his time in WCW was marred by injuries, culminating in a concussion at Starrcade in December 1999. Bret would vacate the title, but in a rematch against Goldberg, regained it before having to vacate it again due to the severity of his injuries. Bret would retire from wrestling in 2000 and suffered a stroke soon after. Over the years, however, he reconciled with Vince McMahon. In 2010, Bret returned to the WWF to face McMahon in a special match at WrestleMania. Additionally, Bret and Shawn Michaels have also mended their relationship. Soon after their match at Survivor Series, Michaels suffered a major back injury in a casket match with The Undertaker. It was so severe that he feared he might never walk properly again. After undergoing surgeries and a prolonged absence from the ring, Michaels made his return in 2002 and won the World Heavyweight Championship in the inaugural Elimination Chamber match at Survivor Series. According to Jim Ross, Vince continued to pay Michaels the entire time he was recovering from his injuries. During his time away from wrestling, Michaels also found faith, becoming a born-again Christian. His reputation improved significantly, and he eventually became WWE's Vice President of Talent Development. In the end, the Montreal Screwjob stands as a testament to the intricacies of power, loyalty, and betrayal within professional wrestling, a world where fiction and reality often blur and the lines between hero and villain become ever more elusive. In the grand scheme of history, the Montreal Screwjob may fade as time marches on, but its lessons remain ever relevant. It reminds us that even in a world built on illusion, the echoes of authenticity and the scars of betrayal resonate far longer than the applause.